There is a book you have probably never heard of. It was published in 2012 by a man named John Kercher. It is not a long book. It is not a complicated book. The title is one word: Meredith. That same year, the case involving his daughter's murder had generated hundreds of news articles, multiple documentary films, 2 competing made-for-TV movies, and a global media debate that had been running for 5 years. The other people involved in the case had agents, publicists, and book deals of their own in progress. John Kercher's book about his daughter sold modestly. It went out of print. I want you to hold that for a moment, because everything I am about to tell you flows from that single fact. This is the story of the murder of Meredith Kercher, not the story of the trial of Amanda Knox, not the story of the Italian justice system, not the story of a prosecutor with a theory that fell apart. Those things are in here. The evidence is in here. All of it. But the center of this story, the person this story is actually about, is a 21-year-old woman from Croydon, South London, who had been in Italy for less than 2 months when someone ended her life in her own bedroom. Her name was Meredith Kercher. We are going to say it a lot in the next 20 minutes, because somebody has to. Perugia is a university town in Umbria, in central Italy. Medieval walls, steep cobblestone streets, a city that has been continuously inhabited for over 2,000 years. Every autumn, it fills with students from across Europe and beyond. Exchange programs, language schools, semester abroad arrangements. Meredith Kercher arrived in Perugia in September 2007. She was 21 years old, in her 3rd year at the University of Leeds, studying European politics and Italian. She had chosen Perugia specifically, the University for Foreigners, one of Italy's oldest institutions for international students. Her Italian was already good. She had been working toward this for years, by all accounts from the people who knew her in Perugia. Classmates, housemates, the staff at the university. She was exactly the kind of person you would want living next door. Careful, warm, organized. She called her family regularly. She explored the city on foot. She was, in the words of her housemate Sophie Purton, who spoke to the BBC in 2011, just genuinely kind. Not performatively kind, just kind. She lived in a cottage at Via della Pergola 7, on the edge of the city. She shared the house with 3 other women, 2 Italian students and an American named Amanda Knox, who had arrived around the same time through a different exchange program. Knox was 20 years old, from Seattle. By her own account and by accounts from people around her at the time, she and Meredith were friendly, but not close. 2 young women from different countries, different backgrounds, sharing a house for a semester. That was the extent of their relationship. Rudy Gued also lived nearby. 20 years old, born in Ivory Coast, raised in Perugia, from the age of 5 by an Italian family. He knew people in the neighborhood. He had been in the house before. Several witnesses would later confirm this. On the evening of October 31st, 2007, Halloween, Meredith went out with friends, came home, and went to bed. The following day, November 1st, was a national holiday in Italy. The city was quiet. Sometime during the night of November 1st into the early hours of November 2nd, someone entered Meredith Kercher's bedroom. She was found the following afternoon. Her door was locked from the inside. A window in another room had been broken. She had been attacked. She had not survived. She had been in Perugia for less than 2 months. Now, this is the part of the video where most true crime coverage pivots to the suspects, to Knox's behavior at the police station, to the interrogation, to the theory the prosecutor built. I'm going to do something different. I'm going to start with the evidence, because the evidence in this case is specific, documented, and in several crucial places, deeply contested. And if you do not understand the forensic picture first, nothing else in this story makes sense. Let's go through it piece by piece. The first piece, Rudy Gade. When forensic investigators processed the crime scene at Via della Pergola 7, they found the following items attributable to Rudy Gade: his DNA on Meredith's body, his DNA on her jacket, a bloody handprint on the wall of her bedroom, consistent with his hand, shoe prints on the floor consistent with his shoe size, fecal matter in the bathroom toilet, unflushed, consistent with his DNA. This evidence was not contested by the defense. It was not contested by Knox's legal team. It was not contested at any point in any of the 4 subsequent legal proceedings. Rudy Gade was in that room. The physical evidence established this beyond any reasonable dispute. He fled to Germany after the murder. He was found, extradited, and tried in a separate fast-track proceeding in October 2008. He was convicted of the murder and sexual assault of Meredith Kercher and sentenced to 30 years imprisonment. On appeal, his sentence was reduced to 16 years. He was released in 2017 after serving his sentence with credit for good behavior. He is currently free. The second piece, the knife. Investigators recovered a kitchen knife from the apartment of Rafael Solicito, Knox's Italian boyfriend of approximately 1 week at the time of the murder. This knife became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, linking Knox directly to the crime. The prosecution's forensic team reported finding 2 DNA profiles on the knife. Knox's DNA on the handle, consistent with having used the knife in a kitchen, which she had, and a second profile on the blade, which they attributed to Meredith Kercher. Here is where it gets complicated. The DNA sample on the blade was extremely small, below 200 picograms, which at the time was widely considered the minimum threshold for a reliable result. The prosecution's experts maintained the result was valid. The defense's experts disputed it. In 2011, the court commissioned an independent forensic review by 2 independent experts, Carla Conti and Stefano Vecchiotti. Their report concluded that the blade sample was too small to test reliably, that the result could not be considered scientifically valid, and that the possibility of environmental contamination could not be excluded. The knife that was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case against Knox was, according to the independent review commissioned by the court itself, evidentially unreliable. The third piece, the bra clasp. Meredith's bra clasp was collected from the crime scene and tested. Investigators reported finding Solicito's DNA on the clasp, specifically on the metal hooks. The defense raised a critical procedural objection. In the original crime scene, photographs taken immediately after the discovery of the body, the bra clasp is visible on the floor of the bedroom. In photographs taken 47 days later, when it was finally collected as evidence, it is in a different position, 47 days on the floor of an active crime scene. The independent Conti-Vecchiotti review examined this evidence as well and raised significant concerns about the collection procedure and the possibility of contamination. They noted that the clasp had visibly moved between the initial documentation and the collection, and that proper forensic protocol had not been followed. The prosecution maintained the DNA result was valid. What the evidence actually shows, Rudy Gade's evidence, uncontested, overwhelming, placed him in the room. The knife linking Knox, contested at every level, found unreliable by independent review. The bra clasp, linking Solicito, contested, collection procedure criticized. Independent review raised contamination concerns. This is not a matter of opinion. This is what the documents say. And understanding this is the only way to understand what happened next. On November 6, 2007, 5 days after Meredith's body was found, Amanda Knox and Raffaele Solicito were arrested. The lead prosecutor was a man named Giuliano Mignini. He had a theory. The theory was that Meredith had been killed during a drug-fueled sex game involving Knox, Solicito, and Guade. That she had refused to participate, that things escalated, and that all three were responsible for her death. There was no physical evidence supporting the sex game theory. The prosecution's own forensic evidence placed only Guade in the room. But the theory took hold, particularly in the Italian press, which gave it extensive coverage in the weeks after the arrest. Knox's behavior, in the days after the murder, became evidence of a different kind. She had done cartwheels while waiting at the police station. She said later she was stretching because she had been sitting for hours. She had kissed Solicito in public outside the cottage, photographed and published widely. She had, in a statement later retracted, named her boss, Patrick Lumumba, as a possible suspect. She said she had been pressured during an overnight interrogation that lasted until 4 in the morning without a lawyer present. Italian media had a name for her within weeks: Foxy Knoxy. The coverage was relentless, detailed, and almost entirely focused on Knox as a character rather than on the evidence. And here is the pattern that this case made visible in a way that almost no other case has. When a young, conventionally attractive woman from a Western country is accused of a serious crime, she becomes the story. The victim does not become the story. The evidence does not become the story. The defendant does. Meredith Kercher was 21 years old. She was kind and careful and had worked hard to get to Perugia. She had a family in England who loved her and were watching from a distance as her name disappeared from the coverage of her own murder. In 2011, her family's spokesperson told the BBC directly. They felt that Meredith had been forgotten, that the case had become about Knox and about the Italian justice system, and about everything except the young woman who had died. They were right. Knox and Solicito were convicted in December 2009 and sentenced to 26 and 25 years respectively. In October 2011, following the independent Conti Vecchiotti forensic review, their convictions were overturned on appeal. They were acquitted and released. Knox flew back to Seattle. Solicito drove home to his family. The story, for most of the world, was over. Except in Italy, it was not over. Here is something that surprises most people who follow this case from an Anglo-American legal tradition. In the United States and in the United Kingdom, double jeopardy protections mean that once you have been acquitted, you cannot generally be tried again for the same crime. The case is closed. The verdict is final. Italy's legal system works differently. The prosecution appealed the acquittal. In January 2014, 2.5 years after Knox had returned to Seattle, 2.5 years after the world considered the case resolved, the Italian Court of Appeal reconvicted Knox and Solicito in absentia. Knox was sentenced to 28.5 years. Solicito, who was still in Italy, had his passport confiscated. Knox did not return to Italy. She has stated publicly she would have been arrested at the border. The case went to the Italian Supreme Court, the Court of Cassation. In March 2015, nearly 8 years after Meredith Kercher's death, the Court of Cassation issued a final ruling. Knox and Solicito were acquitted definitively. The court found that the evidence against them was insufficient and contradictory. The conviction was annulled with no possibility of further appeal. 4 trials, 2 convictions, 2 acquittals, 8 years. And through all of it, through the documentaries and the Netflix series and the competing memoirs and the international media circus, Rudy Guade served his sentence quietly and was released in 2017. The only person whose guilt was never seriously disputed by any court at any level. Free since 2017. Amanda Knox has a memoir. It is called Waiting to be Heard. It was published in 2013 by HarperCollins and became a bestseller. Rafael Solicito has a memoir. It is called Honor-Bound. Also a bestseller. Rudy Gued gave a series of interviews after his release in which he maintained he was not the only person in the room that night, a claim no court has accepted and no evidence has supported. And John Kercher wrote a book about his daughter. One-word title, Meredith, published in 2012. It did not become a bestseller. It went out of print. I looked it up while I was researching this video. You can still find secondhand copies online for a few dollars. Think about that. A father writes the only book that is actually about the victim, the person at the center of this entire 8-year legal and media event. And it is the one that nobody bought. Meredith Kercher studied European politics and Italian. She was in Perugia because she had worked hard enough to get there. She called her family regularly. She was kind. She had been in Italy for less than 2 months. She deserved better than to become a footnote in someone else's story. If you take one thing from this video, find John Kercher's book, read it, or at minimum, remember her name. Not Foxy Noxy, not the Italian justice system, not the prosecutor with the theory. Meredith. Her name was Meredith Kercher, and this was her case.